Hey Woodhaven family, and welcome back to the Journey 24/7 podcast. It is so good to have you back here with us again today as we continue our study through the Gospel of Matthew. Today we're going to be in Matthew chapter 14, and in this chapter it opens up with us hearing about the death of John the Baptist. He was beheaded by Herod. Now this was a different Herod than Herod the Great that we saw was ruling when Jesus was born. This is a different Herod than that. This is his son. But this Herod beheads John the Baptist. And then we see that Jesus learns about it because they go and it says John the Baptist's disciples came and took the body and buried it, and they went and told Jesus. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. Now a lot of times we read that and we think he was mourning. And yes, I'm sure there was some mourning there because John the Baptist was strongly connected to Jesus. So there would have been mourning. But it's not that he was just mourning. What we see, and we saw this back in chapter 12, and I didn't mention it during a recap that day, but we see at times where things started getting really hostile, that Jesus would withdraw. And it wasn't because he didn't want to speak up or to be bold. No, we see him be bold all throughout his life. But it was because he knew that there was a time that was coming for him to go on the cross, to take on our sin. But that time wasn't here yet. And so he would withdraw when things started getting extra hostile at times because he knew that time was not here. And he knew there was more work that he was to accomplish before it got here. And so he withdrew to a desolate place here by himself. Of course, though, the crowds heard of this, and so they followed him on foot from the towns. So he went ashore, he saw this great crowd, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. So he had stepped away for things to de-escalate some. But he sees this crowd that follows him. And it says he had compassion on them and healed their sick. But when it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place, and the day is now over. Send the crowds away to buy food for themselves." But Jesus said, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." Now, you've probably heard this narrative many, many times before of this story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. But there's so many things that we could pull out of it. One, we're seeing Jesus' compassion on him. Two, we're seeing Jesus sees an opportunity to show who he is, to show that he's the Messiah. And so he says, "They need not go away, you give them something to eat." They said to him, "We have only 5 loaves here and 2 fish. And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass, and taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing. Then he broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of the broken pieces left over. So not only did they all eat and were satisfied off of 5 loaves and 2 fish, but they actually had 12 baskets full left over. Now those 12 baskets could also be a callback to the 12 tribes of Israel, but it's also just showing that the Lord's abundance, that he can provide in abundant ways. And it says, "And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children." You see, so often we see this and we just talk about him feeding the 5,000. But this likely would have been closer to 10,000 people when you consider the women and children. Potentially even more. But ultimately, even if it were 5,000, 10,000, whatever, we're still seeing the same miracle here. That Jesus multiplied what was a very, very small amount to feed an abundance of people. That's what Jesus can do with anything. We bring him something that we feel like is a little bit, and he can do great things with it. Think about what he can do if we surrender our entire lives to him. If we give him everything and just say, "Lord, use this to glorify yourself. Use me to glorify yourself." Think about the ways he could use us. Think about if each and every person in our church did that. The Lord can take what we offer and do an absolute abundance with it. Now, real quick before we move on, one other really interesting thing is this miracle, Jesus feeding the 5,000, is the only miracle that appears in all 4 of the Gospels. So it's clear that it was extremely important for us to pay attention to this, to make sure that we don't just gloss past it when we're reading it just because we've read it before. No, it's the Lord just showing us all that he can do. So after this, they finish up here. He sends the disciples ahead in the boat. and he goes up to pray. And so Jesus is up praying on the mountain, and it says when evening came, he was there alone, but the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night he came to them walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." It says, Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And he said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. So Peter showed faith here. He trusted in the Lord, and he walked out on the water. But then the very next verse, "But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, 'Lord, save me.'" And so he gets scared, and he takes his eyes off Jesus and starts looking at the wind that's surrounding him, and notice it, and he's afraid, and he begins to sink. So we saw that initial faith. Then we saw fear take hold and him take his eyes off of Jesus. But then we see the faith come back. As he's sinking, he cries out and says, "Lord, save me." He trusted that Jesus could save him. So in this, we see that in faith, he still had fear, but that fear caused him to take his eyes off of Jesus. And that's when things started to go wrong. That's when he started to sink. Now, I know it's easy to sit here and say we shouldn't fear, but we all know practically it's hard to not have any fear. But remember, when we keep our eyes upon Jesus, he is going to sustain us. And the most beautiful thing is that even if it doesn't work out on this earth, our eternity is sealed with him. So we have no reason to fear. So when you begin to feel those moments of fear, we can't always control exactly the feelings we're feeling, but remind ourselves of the truth. Remind ourselves of the truth of the gospel. Remember to keep our eyes upon Jesus. The disciples saw all of this happen, and it says, "And those in the boat worshipped him, saying, 'Truly, you are the Son of God.'" This is the only time that we see them in the Gospel of Matthew actually refer to Jesus as the Son of God. So the disciples' eyes we see throughout them following after Jesus. Their eyes are just constantly being opened up in a greater and greater way to who he truly is. And here they recognize, "You are the Son of God." That's going to wrap up our study for today. We'll see you back here tomorrow as we finish up our week in Matthew chapter 15.